So this is my first solo video essay, podcast, whatever you want to call it. And today I want to talk about the authenticity industrial complex. Now, I'm not sure what I'm going to title this video, so it might be called something different. So this is Not Who I Am by Emily Bootle. It's our authenticity obsession. And this book explores what authenticity actually means. So the pursuit of authenticity has a lot of contradictions, and it's mostly shaped by societal pressures and capitalist systems that undermine its very premise in the first place. It's considered a very aspirational way to be authentic is somehow more true than others, more righteous than others. Authenticity is seen as a highly aspirational way to be, and it's somehow more true than other ways of being that people consider performative, and performatism is bad, or so society tells us. The person who cries on camera about all of their problems and uploads it to their TikTok is somehow more aspirational, more true, and more authentic than others. No matter your political leanings, most of us assume that, especially online, authenticity is something to strive for, and we praise influencers who we see as being authentic. I argue, and so does this author, that this is not only harmful for us as consumers, but it's also harmful for the influencers themselves. The plague of relatability. Relatable celebrities in the 2010s were always labelled as icons. Think that one Jennifer Lawrence speech. And this led to the rise of content where people are more authentic. And what's more authentic is seen as being sad, basically. So crying on camera, talking about your struggles on camera, and things like that. This subsequently created the expectation of social media influencers to share private details of their lives and praised them for doing it. But this is firstly complicated by the fact that these celebrities and these influencers are profiting off of this relatability or authenticity. They're using that to build themselves trust so that you buy the things that they recommend, so that companies pay them to recommend things. The desire for authenticity at its core is closely interlinked with the wellness industry. This ties authenticity with self-purification and suggests that people have to undergo processes like clean eating or therapy to uncover their true selves. And this then becomes part of the wider cultural conversation in the form of widespread assumptions that self-purification is something that you must strive for, that you have to be a better version of yourself, and ultimately rooted in the idea that the version of yourself that you are is not good. And the idea that there's some kind of true self in the first place, that we can reach an ideal state by purging ourselves of all external influencers, and that it is in fact possible to reach the mythical state of the ideal authentic person. I also want to highlight that this is an inherently individualistic idea. Pressure to confess, with social media serving as a digital confessional, where users feel morally obligated to share their truth and experience a level of guilt over maintaining privacy. This is more often than not directed at women and minorities rather than cis men. This creates an issue in and of itself, and the cultural obsession with authenticity then becomes a way to basically ask women and minorities to justify their existence, to talk about their pain, to talk about all the horrible things that happen to them and broadcast it to the whole world. This is all part of a cultural mythos that ultimately exists to serve capitalism. Firstly, the self-improvement industry, and secondly, the data economy. Cultural obsession with authenticity diminishes our ability to culturally examine inequality because it also shifts focus from systemic issues to individual self-improvement and self-expression. We're all kind of vaguely aware of this, but we struggle to move past this idea of authenticity, and we still have a connection in our minds that authenticity is good. Personally, I've always had the impulse that filming yourself when something difficult happens to you is fucking dystopian, and I know I'm not the only person that sees this, but when you see and interact with online content, the dystopian nature of the act of filming yourself when you're deeply upset about something very rarely occurs to you. We're caught up in the story, but if you zoom out for a minute, it is fucking weird. Most people aren't doing this. I don't do this, and I know the person watching this video probably doesn't do this either. Enough of us praise people for it, whether influencers, celebrities, or just some regular person filming their mental breakdown. And it's created this culture of authenticity. I also don't think that we should place people's lack of media literacy on influencers. It's 2025. Yes, my social media is a highlight reel. It's going to stay that way because the vast majority of people are not entitled to the ugly parts of my life. That is private and it is personal. It's something I'll talk to my mum about, my best friend about, and not many other people because it's private. Yes, my Instagram is a highlight reel and it's going to stay that way. You're not entitled to know private details of bad things that are happening in my life, and there are a fair few of those. I'm not going to share those online. You're not entitled to know that. It's a media literacy issue. We expect influencers and people we follow online and celebrities to justify their highlight reel when actually you should be able to look at that content and go, yeah, actually, I'm comparing myself a bit, but that's not their whole life. They have private things going on that will be similar to issues I am having, perhaps, or different issues that I could not understand. And at this day and age, we should be able to understand that, and we should not put it on influencers or celebrities. More influencers. I don't feel sorry for celebrities, but we should not put it on influencers to be sharing that information with us to make us feel better about ourselves. Oh, that's cold now. That's not pleasant. Now I want to talk about how persuasive UX design contributes to this cycle. So persuasive design, platforms that are persuasively designed also create persuasive content. I've talked about this before in my essay on the psychology of repost warriors. So habit-forming social media platforms create habit-forming content patterns. When you become used to habit-forming cycles, they become more effective. The algorithm is designed to promote content that generates the most interaction and naturally favors material that follows familiar habit-forming patterns. These typically follow the hook cycle, which is trigger, action, reward, investment. And you can map this onto most persuasive design features, whether that's the way that the screen layout is set up on TikTok, the nature of the comment section, or any number of things. So these patterns become deeply ingrained in viewers' expectations and behaviours. Because users become increasingly conditioned to respond to these hook cycles in social media platforms, content that deliberately implements these platforms will also perform better because people are becoming used to them. And content creators and organisations who post things online use this to their benefit. When your content fits perfectly into the hook cycle, success is only a matter of time. In relation to authenticity, this sometimes looks a little different to how it looks in the slacktivism, which is what my essay, The Psychology of Repost Warriors, was about. So the trigger might be something drastic happens in your personal life that invokes a natural human desire to do something equally drastic to solve this problem. The action is creating a short video tearfully explaining the problem. The reward is comments, likes, and views that reward you for being authentic. And the investment is you feel the need to share more of this kind of authenticity because of the social validation that this sharing has brought to you. You mistake this social validation for some kind of healing brought about by being authentic and form an attachment to this way of existing on the internet, and this then becomes a social norm that goes unquestioned. As much as I like this book, in my opinion, its analysis of capitalism isn't emphasised enough. It doesn't fully explore how this commodification of authenticity is driven by the data economy. The author highlights contradictions in authenticity culture, but doesn't fully interrogate how these contradictions serve to entrench corporate power through big tech. Encouraging confession culture basically just means encouraging more data. The ultimate goal of this is to drive the data economy, which isn't discussed as an overarching narrative in the book. It's only really a side note. She mentions it, but it's not fully analysed in relation to all the aspects of the book, nor is it emphasised enough as the ultimate goal of authenticity culture. And I think this really needs to be driven home. The reason that this authenticity culture thrives is because it generates more data, which generates more facts about you, the user, about the person who makes the video that we're thinking is authentic, and it labels those things and it uses them to sell you things. It uses them for targeted advertising for, say, BetterHelp. If you have ADHD, you'll know what I mean. These like apps that constantly pop up to me about we can help you manage your ADHD. Those are mostly based in pseudoscience and some particularly nefarious persuasive design, because they tend to make you do a little quiz at the start that then leads to emotional investment, so you're much more likely to spend money on them, and they're also generally not backed up by evidence. Now, depending on what you're authentic about online, what those targeted advertisements look like will differ, but they will exist. They might be vitamins, for example, they might be supplements, they might be any number of things. So, in the book, the historical roots of this are explored as religion, such as in the idea that the Catholic confession culture is becoming a bit of a collective confession, where instead of talking to a priest, you're talking to social media. I think, firstly, this is very clearly quite westernized and Western focused, and I think the author overestimates the influence that Catholicism has on big tech. I don't know why that's an association you would make, but as someone who was raised Catholic, something that I figured out when I started critiquing the religion was that confession historically is also capitalistically motivated. You went to the priest and you confessed something, the priest might ask you to make a donation to the church as a way of repenting, which is basically partly what helped the Vatican build up to the enormous wealth they have today. Now, I didn't know this as a child. This wasn't what we were taught as the roots of confession, because of course it wasn't. Now, I had a generally positive experience of the church, but I think that this is an angle that's missing in the way that I was taught about it, and I think it's an angle that's missing when she explores the historical roots of this, especially given that she's not, in my opinion, examining capitalism as an overarching narrative nearly enough. She critiques the obsession with self-improvement and individualism, but doesn't propose structural solutions or alternatives to counteract the harms of authenticity culture in the data economy. A stronger critique might have explored collective responses, such as regulation of tech monopolies, data privacy laws, or movements advocating for platform cooperativism. The need for authenticity from those who we follow online is a symptom of an individualized culture where we're so wrapped up in our own lives that we're constantly looking for things that need improvement instead of seeking genuine connection. Instead of questioning why we compare ourselves constantly and the systemic features of capitalism that encourage us to do this or create the conditions that cause it, we expect influencers to show the bad bits so that we can feel better. Partly, like I've said, what we need is better media literacy and an understanding that it's industries like the beauty industry that profit off of our need to compare ourselves to others rather than be curious. And to dismantle these industries and the capitalist greed that creates them is going to be far more productive than demanding that everyone be authentic, whatever the fuck that means. This is also partly related to this idea of recognition theory. This is a book that explains this quite well, Recognition in the Age of Social Media. Institutions of recognition are based on a basic human need to recognize ourselves as a useful member of society, to recognize ourselves in the other. The media has always been a key part of this, and it provides the way through which we are able to recognize ourselves. The emergence of social media can be said to alter the way that we develop recognition. Among scholars that study recognition theory, there's a bit of a hot debate as to whether this is positive or negative, with some claiming that it's positive because it has an impact on greater access to recognition for minorities. However, the superficiality of likes and comments and the algorithmic role in general can be said to socially reward people who align more closely with the neoliberal ideal. So, this book argues that those negative impacts outweigh the positive impacts that it has. Celebrity culture and social media is the most glaring example of this, brought around by what the author calls an economy of intimacy and recognition. This is basically parasocial relationships. That's a fancy word for parasocial relationships. And that's very similar to the critique that's made in this book, which is why I highlight this. Regimes of visibility on social media take advantage of the need to be seen and recognized as worthy through new validations of the self, such as the blue tick. This is dictated entirely by capitalistic platforms and enhanced by the financial incentives that those platforms have for you to spend more time on their platform so that they can gather more data and then sell it. Authenticity, as we know it today on social media, is one of the main ways through which this regime of visibility shows its face. We want to feel seen in the people we follow and admire on social media, but they are financially motivated and frequently much more wealthy than us. So they engage in patterns of false authenticity, which are encouraged by the algorithm because platforms want data so that they can make money. Encouraging confession culture encourages more data, as we've already covered. There's clear parallels between the work on recognition theory and ideas of performative authenticity as a cultural ideal under capitalism. So far, we've critiqued the idea of false authenticity as a vehicle for the data economy brought to you through persuasive design patterns replicated in content. But recognition theory explains exactly why this appeals to us in the first place. The thing about persuasive design and the hook theory is it explains the psychology of how this happens, but what the trigger is always depends on the context. The trigger is often social validation, basically. In this case, the trigger is often this idea of recognition theory, and that's what propels us to being trapped in this hook cycle. We need, as humans, to be recognised in order to socially develop. When this recognition is taking place on social media, it's first of all individualising, and second off, most of what we see comes from people who profit off of false authenticity. So, of course, I'm an advocate for solutions that are collective and solutions that are based in a collective demanding for better technology. A work that I really like on this is Stuck on the Platform, which talks about the idea of platform realism, which is basically similar to capitalist realism, and how we can move past this. This book basically argues that we can't see an age beyond platforms and that we should be striving to create a social movement that creates an exodus away from platforms. I've spoken on my TikTok before about how big tech taking its mask off and being openly fascist rather than secretly fascist is actually going to help with this, because it provides an ideological motivation for people to move away from these platforms because they can see it better. But what can you do? What's an individual action? And I know I'm talking about collective actions are always more important, but something that I also think is interesting is connecting theatre and performance art history to modern digital expression. Creators can successfully embrace intentional performance and create boundaries through persona and master digital self-presentation. There's quite a lot of work on this that I quite like. This is Dialogues on Core. Now, Core is a great example of this sort of performatism as a way of fighting back. Core makes no fucking sense, right? But that's its weapon. It can be used to communicate ideas of feeling disconnected, ideas of feeling angry at capitalism, and it has also been, there's quite a lot of documentation of it being used to show footage of the ongoing genocide in Palestine without it getting picked up by algorithms, and other ways of leftist communication. It allows us to move beyond the real or fake binary and challenge the myth of an authentic self, and recognise that all interaction involves performance, especially under capitalism, and the interaction of the influencer and the viewer is always going to be a performative one. They are performing for you, even if they are performing authenticity. Privacy can emerge as a form of power, emphasising the importance of selective sharing and boundary setting. Media literacy is crucial because people need to learn how platform mechanics work and how they can make informed choices about self-presentation. Performance can become liberation, moving beyond guilt and shame to create connections through conscious performance. Conscious performance, fiction, theatre, film, fiction, I said fiction already, but fiction is important, will communicate things in a way that this sort of valuing of authenticity and valuing of facts and non-fiction narratives as more rational and better than a story that tells the same moral. Ultimately tied with this idea of authenticity. Something that a lot of people have talked about, this idea that we live in an age where fiction is devalued in favour of non-fiction. Now, if you can't tell already, I fucking love non-fiction. But I'm also a fiction reader. I've been a fiction reader my whole life, and I'm primarily a fiction reader. And being able to read fiction or to see a performance piece on short form video on TikTok will communicate things to you in ways that a non-fiction essay might not be able to. There's plenty of examples of this. The popularity of the book Minor Detail in light of the ongoing genocide in Palestine is also an example. I think that book communicates the issue in a way that non-fiction narratives can struggle to grasp, because it encapsulates a whole person's life in a way that a non-fiction essay will not manage to do. Fiction has the power to put you in that person's shoes, and it has the power to help you understand the issue in a different light. We are storytellers. We are performers. We perform for one another as a way of expressing our opinions, our values, and our culture. Social media is trying to tell us that that's bad because authenticity is better than performatism. But that's not true. Being deliberately performative and being conscious about how you do it can lend you a sort of power that authenticity can. Because, like I said, you're always performing. Every interaction involves a level of performance, especially in a capitalist society. So a better approach is to acknowledge that. What this looks like, depending on you as a person, will look different. Examine your digital presence, support alternative models, and encourage building better digital spaces. Instead of focusing on individual impression management and individualized performatism, it's also important to advocate for community-based performance. For example, it can be a coordinated movement, a coordinated way of being performative online in order to get your message. Digital spaces can serve as arenas for collective resistance. Online communities can use coordinated performances to challenge dominant narratives. For example, worker-led campaigns exposing digital exploitation. We can use digital platforms to foster solidarity by amplifying shared struggles rather than privileging individual self-promotion. And we can use a critique of authenticity and a valuing of understanding how we are performing and how we can weaponize that, rather than privileging individual self-promotion. Social roles can be analysed not just as individual choices, but as products of material conditions and power structures. And performatism online can show a really great way of doing that. For example, core, as I've already discussed. A lot of discussions of social roles and how digital personas create human performance, a lot of work on that emphasizes individual work. There's often an overemphasis on individual agency and a neglect of collective dynamics, as well as an alignment of capitalist norms. So it's important to move past that and be able to connect this idea of intentional performance to the collective struggle.